Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into medieval Europe. So go ahead, dim the lights, stretch your shoulders, and let the day fall away. Because tonight's topic is strangely comforting. The long list of temporary medieval inventions, customs, and royal decisions that absolutely refused to disappear. You know the type, those little stopgap solutions that were meant to last a few months, and then clung on for centuries like a determined barnacle. And naturally, many of them came from kings. Kings who thought they were making quick fixes. Kings who wanted just a small change. Kings who, in typical royal fashion, somehow managed to create long-term disasters with the enthusiasm of someone knocking over a candle in a wooden house. So settle in, breathe. Let us float gently into the first of these medieval temporary ideas that somehow lasted longer than entire dynasties. The medieval beard tax that refused to go away. Let's start with one of the stranger examples. Taxes on beards. You'd think facial hair would be a fairly simple matter. You grow it, you shave it, you ignore it, or you braid it dramatically like a Viking But in medieval Europe, rulers kept trying to temporarily regulate beards for moral reasons, political reasons, or just because they were bored, only for these rules to linger far longer than planned. Take Henry VIII. Yes, the same Henry who collected wives like mismatched antique plates. At one point, he imposed a beard tax. It wasn't meant to last. It was more of a gentle reminder that the king, naturally, should decide what your chin looked like. And yet, once a monarch discovers that charging people money for having hair on their face is surprisingly profitable, it tends not to end. The tax drifted on. Different rulers revived it. Others expanded it. It became one of those lingering ideas, floating through the 16th century like a slightly confused ghost. Imagine an entire kingdom spending decades arguing over facial hair prices. But of course they did. These are the same people who held multi-year debates on how long a shoe's pointy toe should legally be. The temporary fortress that accidentally became a permanent city. Next, let's drift north, to a place where the wind is cold, the roofs are steep, and the kings are often named something like Magnus or Harold, as if destined to swing an axe at some point. During the High Middle Ages, Scandinavian rulers built wooden fortresses. They were meant to be temporary quick military bases, thrown together while armies moved across the countryside. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of pop-up tents. But one of these temporary forts, placed at a strategic river crossing, kept being rebuilt. A few soldiers turned into a few merchants, then a few fishermen. Then someone said, well, as long as we're here, maybe let's build a church. And before long, a temporary military outpost had grown into an actual settlement. A settlement became a village became a town, and eventually, it became Stockholm, a capital city, born from something meant to last a few months. Medieval permanence was, apparently, just a matter of forgetting to take something down. Royal wardrobe experiments that became law. If you've ever seen medieval fashion, you already know it was questionable. Pointy shoes so long they required ankle chains, sleeves that dragged several feet behind their owners, hats shaped suspiciously like pastries. Most of these weren't meant to endure. They were seasonal fashion, trends, royal experiments designed to amuse nobles for a winter or two. But then the kings stepped in. A king would notice a style, panic about social disorder, and impose a temporary regulation. Something like, no sleeves longer than your torso, no shoes longer than 12 inches, no hat shaped like a baked good unless you are of noble blood. These rules were mundane, tedious, and extremely medieval. They were also supposed to be temporary, but once written down, laws have a habit of sticking. And so, for centuries, European towns had detailed legal charts explaining exactly how pointy your boots were allowed to be. Some towns even had wooden measurement sticks at the gates. Imagine entering a medieval city and having your shoes examined, like a fashion-based customs inspection. And to think, it all started because a noble got bored one winter and said, what if we made the shoes even longer? A temporary royal household that never disbanded. Let's drift over to France, because of course something mildly absurd happened there. French kings, especially during the Capetian dynasty, loved creating offices. They had officials for counting royal chickens, officials for supervising the royal wine barrels, officials for watching other officials watch the chickens and the wine barrels. One particular office began as a short-term assignment, the keeper of the royal bedsheets. This was supposed to be a temporary role, someone to monitor linen supplies while the court reorganized its households in the 11th century. But it didn't end. The office lingered, and as the centuries passed, it grew in prestige. Suddenly the keeper of the royal bedsheets had assistants, then a heraldic badge, then a ceremonial seat at certain events. By the 14th century, the position came with land grants, land for looking after sheets. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most medieval outcomes ever recorded. Something intended as a 3-week housekeeping job turned into a multi-generational bureaucratic legacy. Heresy courts that were meant to be temporary. Here's a slightly heavier one, but we'll keep it soft and floaty. The church created local heresy courts in the 12th century. They were meant as quick, temporary measures to deal with rising religious debates, just a brief system to stabilize tensions. Naturally, they grew and spread and lasted and lingered far beyond the point anyone intended. They became bureaucratic machines, slow, grinding, often confused. Sometimes they held trials over the shape of a cloak's hood, or whether someone's neighbor saw them making too many candles, which if you squint someone could interpret as sorcery, and all from a temporary idea, a stopgap. Medieval institutions had the lifespan of especially determined tortoises, a temporary royal tax that became a tradition. Every medieval king had one thing in common: they needed money. For wars, for palaces, for more wars, and sometimes too buy rugs exotic enough to impress their cousins. So when England's King Edward III needed funds for the 100 Years' War, he introduced a small, temporary wool tax. Wool was England's main export, its medieval equivalent of oil or microchips. The tax worked too well, actually. Money flooded in, and a temporary tax became permanent. Then higher, then complicated, then deeply confusing. It became so entrenched that even centuries later, England was still shaping foreign policy around wool profits. Wars, alliances, marriages, yes, even royal marriages were influenced by a tax originally meant to last a single campaign season. Imagine being stuck with an accidental tax for 300 years. But then, this is the medieval world. People were still legally required to practice archery on weekends, so nothing should surprise us. Marriage alliances that were supposed to be temporary peace deals. And now let us gently drift into one of medieval Europe's favorite mistakes: marriage diplomacy. Let's create peace by forcing 2 teenagers to marry each other, said nearly every king in Europe. It'll be temporary, just to stabilize things. Except it never was. These marriages created entire dynasties. They reshaped borders. They accidentally unified kingdoms nobody intended to unify. Some even caused massive wars centuries after the original couple had died and been quietly tucked into matching marble coffins. One of the best examples is the marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their union was meant to be a political truce, a brief stabilizer, a royal band-aid. Instead, it united Spain permanently and changed European history in ways no advisor had planned. Imagine intending to host a small dinner and accidentally creating a nation. That is the energy of medieval royal marriage diplomacy, a temporary language that became tradition in medieval courts. Latin was supposed to be a temporary scholarly language, a placeholder, something for clergy and scribes, while local languages developed proper grammar. But Latin clung on with extraordinary persistence. Kings loved it, priests loved it, scholars adored it. Even when nobody spoke it fluently anymore, it refused to leave like the world's most official ghost. And so, for centuries, important documents were written in a language half the scribes only almost understood. This led to some truly legendary mistranslations. My personal favorite: a monk once mistranslated "he went to the market as he ascended to the heavens," which, depending on how you feel about vegetable shopping, might be accurate. Temporary crusader camps that became permanent states. Let's float to the Eastern Mediterranean now, where crusaders in the 11th century built temporary camps, simple military settlements meant to last a few weeks. except the Crusaders quickly realized they liked the climate, and the food, and the local architecture, and the fact that, back home, European winters were damp, miserable, and filled with muddy streets. So temporary camps became permanent strongholds. Strongholds became lordships. Lordships became full kingdoms. The Kingdom of Jerusalem began, essentially, because knights kept forgetting to pack up their tents. The temporary plague rules that became everyday life, and finally, let's drift through the aftermath of the Black Death. Cities introduced temporary health regulations, quarantine stations, cordoned off ship docks, and compulsory pest control. These were emergency measures to survive the disaster. They ended up becoming permanent parts of urban life. Even centuries later, cities still had designated plague streets. Officials still inspected cargo with suspicious enthusiasm. People continued to burn herbs in public squares long after anyone believed it helped. Medieval temporary solutions had a remarkable ability to become traditions. All you needed was time, and a kingdom that forgot to repeal them. Let's pause here, breathe, you're drifting deeper. And in the next part, we'll explore even stranger medieval temporary inventions, things that should VA disappeared within a season but somehow became cultural fixtures, royal institutions, or entire lifestyles. Alright, let's settle back in. If you're listening in bed, maybe sink a little deeper into your pillow. Let the room dim around you, and let your mind drift back into the gentle absurdity of medieval Europe, where temporary ideas had the survival instincts of feral cats and refused to disappear, even when everyone wished they would. Tonight, we're continuing our quiet wander through accidental traditions, unintentional legacies, and small medieval quirks that somehow lasted longer than the actual kings who invented them. So take a slow breath. Let's drift onward, softly, into the next set of medieval mishaps that overstayed their welcome. The temporary pilgrim route that became a pan-European highway. Imagine this, a single dirt path somewhere in 10th century France, cleared temporarily so a small group of pilgrims could walk safely toward the shrine of St. James. It wasn't meant to be a major road, just a convenient shortcut to avoid bandits, mud, and that one village where the cows were unusually judgmental. But pilgrims kept using it. Then merchants started using it. Then innkeepers noticed the opportunity and built taverns. Then entire towns sprang up along the path like mushrooms after a heavy rain. That temporary footpath became the Camino de Santiago, one of Europe's most enduring pilgrimage routes. It's still used today. A medieval shortcut, now a cultural institution. Medieval Europe had a real talent for accidentally inventing things by simply forgetting to remove them. A temporary royal pet project that became a national symbol. Let's drift softly over to Bohemia, where Emperor Charles IV decided he really liked lions. Not metaphorically literal lions. He imported them, along with other exotic animals, to create a temporary royal menagerie. It was supposed to be a brief attraction for visiting nobles, something to point at during banquets when conversation got dull. But people adored it. Courtiers asked to see the lions. Foreign dignitaries wrote about them. Soldiers sketched them on shields. And slowly, over the years, lions became symbolic of the Bohemian crown. All from a short-lived royal hobby, a passing fancy, a medieval what if we brought in something cool for a week moment. Now imagine explaining to Charles IV that his casual lion purchase would shape his kingdom's identity for centuries. Even he would have raised an eyebrow. The temporary bishop's residence that became an architectural monster. Church officials often traveled. They needed temporary living quarters in various cities, simple places with a bed, a desk, and maybe a decent spot to store manuscripts written by monks who didn't understand commas yet. So near the Rhine, bishops began building temporary residences. Simple, functional, modest. And then, naturally, they kept building and expanding and embellishing, because one bishop didn't want to live in a smaller house than the last bishop, and on it went. Over centuries, these modest lodgings turned into sprawling monastery palace hybrids. Entire economic districts grew around them. Some became so large and elaborate that visiting kings would pause and ask, very gently, "Are you sure this is temporary?" What began as humble guest houses became architectural giants, and they still stand today, stone reminders of clergy who didn't understand the meaning of moderation. The temporary tournament rule that became knightly tradition. Knights loved tournaments. They also loved injuring each other in tournaments, which was a problem if you were a king who wanted your nobles to survive long enough to pay taxes. So a temporary rule was created in the 13th century. During certain events, knights would use blunted weapons. It was meant to be a short-term safety measure, just until everyone calmed down a little. But knights loved it. Blunted weapons meant fewer fatalities. Fewer fatalities meant more tournaments, and more tournaments meant more bragging rights, more drinking, and more opportunities to wear expensive feathers on their helmets. Soon, blunted weapons became the norm. They even developed special terminology: tournalances, rebated swords, practiced maces. A safety rule turned into an entire knightly tradition. Something meant to last a few months became a cornerstone of chivalric culture. A temporary market day that became a 900-year festival in one small medieval townlet. Drift to England for a moment. The local lord decided to hold a single special market day, just one, to celebrate a saint's feast. A temporary event to help stimulate trade and cheer up villagers who were tired of eating root vegetables in various disappointing forms. People loved it. Merchants arrived from miles away. Jugglers showed up, as jugglers tend to do. Someone probably played the bagpipes against everyone's wishes. The next year, they did it again and again. Soon it became a yearly fair, then a regional tradition, then a centuries-old festival that still exists today, complete with costumes, games, and food stalls selling dishes that would horrify their medieval ancestors. One impulsive market day evolved into nearly a millennium of cultural celebration. The medieval world's version of Sure, Why Not? The temporary castle siege camp that became a permanent village. Now let's float over to Italy, where military campaigns were a seasonal thing like spring cleaning, except with more siege engines. During one campaign, a siege camp was constructed near a stubbornly fortified town. It had tents, temporary wooden sheds, a well, and a handful of makeshift shops selling wine and roasted chestnuts to bored soldiers. But the siege dragged on, and on, and on. Winter came, spring arrived, and still, nothing happened. Eventually the soldiers built sturdier huts. Their families joined them. Farmers realized the soldiers needed food and moved closer. Merchants arrived next. A baker set up shop. A smithy opened. By the time the siege ended, the camp had quietly transformed into a functioning village. Nobody wanted to leave, and the commanders, tired and cold, said fine, let them stay. Today, several European towns can trace their origins back to temporary siege camps that became permanent settlements entirely by accident. The temporary court jester that became a generational position in royal courts. There was always someone with the unfortunate job of keeping the king amused. Sometimes it was a clever comedian, sometimes it was a musician, sometimes it was a courtier who made one lucky joke and regretted it for the rest of his life. These positions were usually temporary until a king became attached. Then the jester stayed, and stayed, and stayed. Some jesters held their roles for decades. When they died, their children inherited the position, because apparently nothing says career security like being funny for the king, who can legally imprison you for a bad punchline. What began as a short-term entertainment gig, basically medieval freelance work, became a respected court role, complete with wages, privileges, and sometimes their own lands. A temporary distraction became a royal institution. Temporary watermills that became central to entire economies. Watermills in early medieval Europe were basic, provisional, thrown up near rivers to grind grain quickly during harvest season. But as grain grew more important and as peasants grew tired of grinding it by hand, these seasonal mills became permanent. Aristocrats seized them, clergy acquired them. Mills became monopolies, economic centers, even political leverage points. A temporary tool became critical infrastructure, and naturally, it led to a whole world of new rules, taxes, disputes, and several centuries of peasants arguing about who got to use the mill first. a temporary map that became the standard for 400 years. Early medieval maps were not meant to be accurate. They were symbolic, helpful diagrams for a particular monastery or school, temporary teaching tools. But one map, the two map, survived far longer than expected. It was simple, a circle divided by a T, representing Asia, Europe, and Africa. It wasn't geographically correct, or helpful, or even particularly detailed, but monks copied it again and again because it was easy, and familiar, and required very little ink. So a teaching doodle became the default way Europeans visualized the world for centuries, all because someone preferred drawing circles instead of coastlines. Temporary roads built for royal visits that became main highways. When a medieval king traveled, everything stopped. Villages cleaned up, bridges were repaired in a hurry, and new roads were sometimes built, quick paths, to impress visiting royalty. These roads were never meant to last, just a bit of infrastructure to make sure the king didn't fall into a ditch. But after the king passed, the people kept using the new roads. Merchants found them convenient. Farmers liked the shortcuts. Carts rolled along them until they became deeply carved tracks. Temporary royal pathways became major long-term highways. In some places, modern roads still follow their routes. A king's convenience trip became a millennium-old transportation network. Your breathing should be slow now, steady. As we drift through these medieval oddities, notice how every temporary decision somehow lingered into permanence. And in part 3, we'll explore even more of these accidental traditions, laws, habits, superstitions, and royal decisions that stuck around far longer than logic ever intended. Welcome back. Let's settle in again, slowly. If you're drifting towards sleep, that's exactly the point. Just let your mind float as we wander deeper into the soft, dim-lit corridors of medieval history. Tonight, we continue exploring temporary ideas, fixes, and royal impulses that somehow ended up staying centuries longer than the kings who created them. So take a deep breath, loosen your shoulders, and let's drift gently into another round of medieval persistence, the kind nobody asked for. The temporary royal motto that became a permanent battle cry. Let us start with a king who probably never expected anything he scribbled on a banner to last longer than one campaign season. During the 12th and 13th centuries, European rulers often came up with quick inspirational mottos before wars, phrases meant to boost morale for a single battle. But one early French king scribbled a phrase that caught on with knights, then with nobles, then with the people, and soon it was engraved on shields, carved into stone walls, stitched onto banners, and repeated in churches to the point that removing it would have caused a national debate about patriotism. What began as a temporary battlefield motto became a sacred symbol of identity. It stuck around for centuries. It even outlived the languages it was originally written in. Imagine writing a pep talk post-it and ending up with a national slogan. Very medieval. A temporary wine shortage law that became permanent regulation. Wine was crucial in medieval Europe mostly because the water quality ranged from highly questionable to sentient. So when a terrible grape harvest struck Burgundy in the 14th century, local authorities created a temporary rule limiting how much wine taverns could serve per day. It was supposed to last one season, just until the vines recovered. But of course, medieval officials discovered that controlling taverns gave them a deeply satisfying sense of power, so the temporary rule stayed, and expanded again. By the 15th century, some towns had entire chapters of municipal law devoted to wine rationing, restrictions on pouring, storage, pricing, and even moral punishments for bartenders who looked too enthusiastic. A temporary drought measure became a permanent part of civic life. Mostly because Europe loved regulating alcohol almost as much as it loved drinking it. The temporary shrine that became a full cathedral in many medieval towns. Small roadside shrines were built after miraculous events, usually a shepherd having a vision, a farmer tripping in a field of lilies, or a monk seeing a cloud shaped vaguely like a saint if you tilted your head far enough. These shrines were never meant to be important, just temporary markers of piety. Modest altars with a candle or two. But, predictably, things escalated. Pilgrims visited, donations poured in, Merchants set up stalls selling every medieval equivalent to fridge magnets. The local bishop realized he could get some prestige out of the situation. Soon the shrine gained a roof, then stone walls, then a full choir, then, well, a cathedral. A spontaneous moment of piety became a multi-century architectural project that drained the town's treasury and justified a dozen new taxes. Temporary feast days that became mandatory annual holidays. Medieval rulers loved declaring spontaneous feast days. A victory, a royal birth. Someone found a relic behind a barn. Let's party. These were intended as single-day celebrations, a brief excuse for villagers to drink ale at noon and avoid farm work. But people enjoyed these feast days far more than their kings anticipated. And because the medieval public had strong memories when it came to free food, they expected the feasts to return every year. By the time a king tried saying, "Actually, that was just for last year," the villagers immediately replied with the medieval version of "no takebacks." So temporary festivals quietly became permanent holidays. Generations passed. People forgot the original reason the feast even existed, but tradition stayed. The temporary royal wardrobe experiment that became national fashion. Let's drift toward England now, where Edward III once ordered a new royal cloak design made from a specific type of imported fabric. It was meant for one ceremony, a one-time aesthetic choice, but courtiers loved it. They copied it. Then nobles in nearby counties copied them. Merchants followed. And before long, the entire kingdom was wearing this fabric as if it were mandated by the crown. By the time Edward realized his simple fashion experiment had become a nationwide phenomenon, it was too late. Complaining about it would have made him look unfashionable, so a temporary cloak pattern became an enduring English trend. Once again, medieval fashion proved it was basically a slow-moving avalanche, impossible to control and mildly ridiculous. A temporary peasant requirement that became a generational burden. Kings regularly introduced temporary wartime duties for peasants, extra harvest levies, road repairs, bridge maintenance. These were meant to be brief contributions to the war effort, but after the war, kings tended to forget to repeal them, or pretended to, or simply enjoyed the benefits too much. So temporary obligations became permanent traditions, passed down from father to son. Entire villages spent centuries performing tasks originally intended to last a few months. There were towns where peasants still repaired a specific bridge long after the original river had changed course. One village continued delivering hay to a castle decades after the castle's owner had died without heirs. Nothing lingered like medieval bureaucracy. Temporary royal advisors who became permanent fixtures. Kings often appointed advisors just for this crisis. A wise monk, a respected noble, or occasionally the one literate person in the room. They were meant to serve briefly and disappear once the problem was solved. But kings got attached. Advisors stayed longer, their influence grew, and eventually they became entrenched parts of government. Some advisors held office for so long they outlived 2 or 3 kings, quietly shaping policy like moss growing on a stone. A short-term role became a lifelong career, purely by inertia. A temporary crusader supply depot that became a prosperous port city during the Crusades. European armies needed supply points on the Mediterranean coast. These were meant to be temporary logistical hubs, warehouses, with some docks, guarded by a few knights. But once merchants discovered these depots, everything changed. Trade exploded, markets formed, houses appeared around the docks, and suddenly there was a town where there had been an empty coastline. A temporary warehouse became a thriving port city. By the time crusading ended, the towns were so prosperous that nobody dared dismantle them. One of these places even evolved into a major medieval trade center, outliving the Crusades by centuries. A storage facility turned into an urban legacy. Temporary rules about bells that became centuries of noise. Regulation. Medieval towns used bells for everything: warnings, curfews, celebrations, market openings, fire alerts, you name it. But after a particularly enthusiastic bell-ringing season, possibly involving a few overexcited apprentices who mistook every cloud for a disaster, The town council imposed temporary rules limiting bell usage. They intended to calm things down, just for a bit, but the rules stuck, and eventually became strict municipal regulations governing exactly when and how loudly bells could ring. Some towns even produced official bell schedules, which, frankly, feels both extremely medieval and extremely unnecessary. Temporary marriage rules that became ironclad traditions. In certain medieval regions, church officials introduced temporary rules to control marriage practices, especially during famine years, when families were desperate and willing to marry off their children at alarming speeds. One rule required couples to obtain public approval through weeks of bans, announcements, read aloud in church. This was meant to be a short-term stabilizer, but the church discovered it was surprisingly effective at controlling social behavior, so they kept it and expanded it, and eventually, bans became a mandatory part of Christian marriage for centuries. A temporary social safeguard became a religious institution. Your breathing should be soft again now, your thoughts drifting. Medieval people really were masters of making temporary things permanent, half by accident, half by impressive levels of forgetfulness. In Part 4, we'll float further into the strange, sleepy world of medieval leftovers, customs, punishments, royal whims, and city rules that clung on for hundreds of years. Welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavier, that's perfect. Just let your mind soften around the edges as we drift deeper into this slow, drowsy tours of medieval habits that clung on far longer than anyone intended. We're continuing our quiet wander through temporary fixes, stopgap laws, and spontaneous traditions that somehow turned into centuries-long commitments. The medieval world didn't really know how to let go. It preferred to gently procrastinate for about 400 years. So relax your breathing, sink softly into the pillow, and let's drift onward. The temporary castle repairs that became a century-long construction project in medieval times. Castles were constantly breaking, whether sieges, over-enthusiastic feasts that stressed the floorboards, so kings and nobles would order temporary repairs, quick fixes intended to last a year or two. A patch of wall here, a new timber beam there, a moat that probably didn't need to be quite that deep. But medieval masons had a talent for turning small projects into generational oddities. A 1-year repair became a 5-year rebuild, then a 10-year expansion. Then the lord's heirs took over and added their own ideas. Suddenly, what began as a brief repair turned into a century-long architectural adventure. Some castles were never finished. They just accumulated scaffolding like a fashion accessory. A temporary patch-up became a permanent construction zone. A temporary tax exemption that became a sacred privilege. Let's float over to France, where a small village once received a temporary tax exemption after a devastating flood, just for a year, to recover crops and rebuild homes. But villagers remember things, especially when those things involve not paying taxes. So when the year ended, they insisted the exemption was still needed, and the next year, and the next. Kings and officials changed, laws changed, but somehow the village kept its temporary tax relief through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and into early modern Europe. It became so entrenched that later monarchs didn't even question it. It was simply tradition. A 1-year financial break transformed into a centuries-old privilege simply because no one wanted to be the monarch who took it away. The temporary execution method that became standard punishment. Execution methods in medieval Europe were rarely planned with long-term policy in mind. Often, someone simply improvised. In one region, authorities needed a quick, temporary method to punish thieves while the main gallows were being repaired after an unfortunate storm war. Possibly an oversized medieval criminal, depending on who you believe. They improvised a new device, simple, cheap, efficient, and everyone loved it. Well, not the criminals, but the officials did. So the temporary solution became the new standard. Local judges adopted it, then neighboring towns copied it. Suddenly, it was the official regional method for nearly 2 centuries. A temporary backup plan became a legal tradition. A temporary water rationing rule that became a town custom during a dry summer in the 1200s. A small alpine town introduced temporary water sharing rules. Households were required to draw water only at certain hours. Cattle were watered on alternating days. Bread making was restricted to mornings. It was supposed to last until the rain returned, which it did, but villagers found the rules oddly convenient. Everything became predictable, peaceful. Nobody fought over the well anymore. The baker had set hours, the shepherds had a routine, and the local priest appreciated not being woken at midnight by someone trying to fill a bucket. So the temporary drought regulations remained for centuries, long after anyone remembered the drought, or the original reason, or, frankly, the point. But tradition is tradition. The temporary use of Latin that became a linguistic obsession in early medieval Europe. Latin was used as a temporary scholarly language, practical, convenient, a neutral middle ground between wildly different local dialects. It wasn't intended to dominate education, law, medicine, and religion for 1,000 years, but monks liked it, clergy insisted on it, universities refused to switch, and eventually Latin became the default long after the public understood absolutely none of it. For centuries, students learned subjects in a dead language because of a temporary measure designed to simplify early monastic records. A linguistic compromise turned into an intellectual empire, a temporary truce that became a generational peace tradition. There were periods during the 100 Years' War when both England and France were too tired, broke, or confused to keep fighting, so temporary truces were called, brief pauses to regroup, or complain, or attempt diplomacy that neither side really believed in. But some of these truces lasted surprisingly long. Villagers started treating them as holidays, merchants ran special trade fairs, nobles arranged hunts and tournaments. Over time, a brief truce became a recurring, expected peace season. When kings tried to break it, the public got upset, because apparently everyone appreciated not being shot at for a few months. A temporary wartime pause became part of the social calendar, a temporary monastic rule that became a global movement. Early monastic communities sometimes experimented with rules: silence during meals, shared labor, certain prayer hours, modest diets. These were meant as short-term spiritual exercises, but monks took discipline extremely seriously. Once a rule was introduced, even temporarily, it tended to stay, and then spread again, copied by other monasteries that wanted to look properly holy. A week-long spiritual trial became a lifelong commitment, and eventually, entire monastic orders worldwide adopted rules originally meant for a single monk who probably thought he'd try silence for a weekend. The temporary use of heraldic animals that became noble identity heraldry, at first, was temporary. Knights needed ways to identify each other in tournaments when everyone wore metal hats and identical armor, so they chose random animals: a lion, a boar, a badly drawn eagle that looked more like a startled chicken. These symbols were never meant to be permanent, just seasonal decorations, but families clung to them, and within a generation, these temporary symbols became sacred identity markers. Entire dynasties defined themselves by animals their ancestors had chosen in a hurry on the morning of a tournament. Some noble houses fought wars over heraldic symbols that started as rushed doodles. Medieval pride truly knew no limits. A temporary road toll that became a generational annoyance. Road tolls began innocently enough. A town needed to repair a bridge, so they placed a temporary toll booth to fund the construction. The bridge was repaired within months, but the toll stayed, and stayed, and stayed. By the time locals asked why the toll existed, the officials simply shrugged and said, "Tradition." Temporary funding became permanent taxation because medieval officials never encountered a fee they wanted to remove. A temporary royal wardrobe ban that lasted centuries at one point. A European king, irritated by excessive noble fashion, issued a temporary ban on a certain luxurious fabric, just until inflation calmed down, or until nobles stopped competing to see who could dress like a walking tapestry. But sumptuary laws have a funny way of sticking around. The ban became law, the law became custom, and custom became a moral judgment about anyone who dared wear the forbidden cloth. By the time the king died, the ban had become so entrenched that later rulers didn't bother changing it. A temporary rule about fancy sleeves became a cultural obsession. Your breathing should be slow again, your mind drifting gently across time. Everything in the medieval world had a way of lingering, like dust on old stone, like forgotten obligations, like festival days no one remembered the meaning of, but celebrated anyway. When you're ready, we'll continue drifting into part 5, exploring even more short-lived ideas that accidentally became permanent fixtures of medieval life. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake at this point, congratulations. You've officially outlasted at least 3 medieval kings, 2 monastic reforms, and the average lifespan of a 12th century peasant broom. Let's continue drifting through those charmingly persistent medieval inventions, quirks, and temporary solutions that somehow miraculously never went away. Just settle in again, deep breaths, soft pillows, and let's meander onward. The medieval university system, a temporary club that turned into a global bureaucratic maze. When the first medieval universities appeared in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were not designed to become permanent institutions. They were basically informal student-teacher guilds, small circles of men in robes arguing about Aristotle and trying very hard not to freeze to death inside drafty lecture halls. Think of them as early academic chat groups, except every discussion was mandatory. No one had washed in weeks, and disagreements occasionally ended with a riot in the streets. Naturally, back then, universities were supposed to be flexible gatherings. Travel here, learn a bit, travel there, argue a bit more, nothing too rigid. But because humans cannot resist creating paperwork, the whole thing snowballed. By the 13th century, universities like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna had grown into bureaucratic labyrinths with rules about everything robust: lecturing times, dorm fees, exam schedules, disputation ceremonies, and, of course, which books were allowed. Because nothing says the free pursuit of knowledge quite like a long list of banned texts nailed to a cathedral door. Professors gained fixed positions, students developed traditions that refused to die, and the temporary club of scholars quietly transformed into the cornerstone of modern education. And yes, we still argue about Aristotle. The medieval love of Latin, a temporary communication fix that just wouldn't leave Latin, was supposed to be a temporary patch for communication across Europe, a kind of medieval Esperanto, if Esperanto had ever caught on, and was also aggressively mandatory. By the 12th century, Latin was becoming a second language, then a third language, then a language almost no one spoke at home. But universities, churches, and governments insisted on clinging to it, because nothing signals authority quite like speaking a language no peasant can understand. A bishop could give a sermon in Latin to a congregation that understood none of it, and still feel extremely accomplished. Legal documents were written in Latin because lawyers didn't want the public to understand what was going on naturally. Doctors used Latin so patients couldn't argue back, and scholars used Latin because, well, they always had, and change sounded exhausting. By the 1500s, Latin should have faded away, but nope. It quietly lived on in churches, medicine, biology, mottos, and every time someone tries to sound clever with per se or etc., a temporary convenience, an eternal inconvenience. The medieval distinction between noble blood and everyone else, a social fiction that never got retired medieval nobles, invented the concept of noble blood as a temporary way to justify why they got to own everything. We deserve privileges because our ancestors were special, they declared without offering proof, DNA tests, or, frankly, any evidence that their ancestors were anything other than unusually lucky and slightly better armed. It was meant as a quick political explanation, something simple, something flexible, except it became a full-blown belief system. By the 13th century, nobles were obsessively tracing lineages back to Charlemagne, or pretending to, sometimes both. Someone would claim descent from an ancient hero, and everyone else would nod politely while knowing full well that the family tree had been, let's say, aggressively embellished. Entire dynasties continued for centuries on the basis of a story someone invented over a nice dinner in 1080. And here we are today, still watching royalty on television, still discussing bloodlines, still witnessing people receive ceremonial roles because a distant ancestor decided to wear a crown one day. A temporary justification became a long-term social habit. Nobody ever stopped. Heraldry, a temporary battlefield label that became an eternal hobby for aristocrats in the early Middle Ages. Heraldry was basically medieval team jerseys, a temporary practical idea. Let S mark shields with patterns so we don't accidentally stab the wrong guy. Simple enough, but it didn't stay simple. Soon, nobles were painting increasingly ridiculous symbols onto their shields: dragons, lions, eagles that looked suspiciously like chickens, and vague animals that scholars still cannot confidently identify. One family even adopted a hedgehog, because apparently someone thought that would strike fear into the hearts of enemies. By the 13th century, heraldry had become a full-blown obsession. Tournaments had heraldic judges. Nobles argued for generations about who had the right to use a particular shade of blue. Badges appeared everywhere, on banners, dishes, bed linens, horses, and occasionally, places horses really did not want paint applied. What started as a battlefield convenience turned into an eternal aristocratic hobby. Modern nations still design heraldic crests. British passports still have them, and dozens of medieval symbols that were supposed to be temporary are now locked into centuries of tradition. Thanks, knights. The medieval year and a day rule, a temporary legal shortcut that became permanent tradition. The phrase, "a year and a day," appears everywhere in medieval law. If a runaway serf managed to hide in a town for a year and a day, they were free. If someone held land for a year and a day, they had legal rights to it. If you didn't complain about something within a year and a day, the matter was considered settled. Why a year and a day? Because medieval legal scholars wanted a simple rule that didn't require careful counting. 12 months, confusing. 4 seasons, too vague. A year and 1 more day, perfect. No one could argue with that. It was a temporary legal shortcut, yet somehow it became a sacred formula repeated in courts for centuries. Even modern contracts occasionally reference this medieval extra day language, echoing a time when counting was optional and patience was limited. The medieval temporary city walls that became permanent landmarks, cities like York, Carcassonne, Avila, and Lubeck, built defensive walls during moments of crisis, usually because someone rude with an army was approaching. The walls were meant to be temporary fortifications until the danger passed. But tearing down giant stone walls takes effort, and medieval cities were chronically short on effort, so the temporary walls stayed, generation after generation, long after the original enemy had given up, died, or moved on to a different hobby. Some cities expanded and simply built newer, bigger walls outside the old ones, leaving layers of temporary defenses fossilized in the urban landscape, like a geological sandwich of panic. Those temporary walls are now World Heritage Sites, tourist attractions, and Instagram backgrounds. A vast stone reminder that procrastination sometimes creates beauty. The medieval tendency to create complicated taxes that no one ever repealed. In the medieval world, rulers often invented new taxes as temporary measures during war or famine. The logic went like this: just for now, they said. A brief solution, they insisted. We'll remove it when things calm down. They promised, knowing full well that nothing ever calms down in medieval Europe. And so temporary taxes stuck around permanently. A tax for defending the kingdom that remained long after peace returned. A tax for maintaining bridges, even in towns with no bridges. A tax for crusades that no one actually went on. A tax for the king's personal expenses, which were never, ever complete. The English monarchy was especially notorious for this. One king would invent a tax, the next king would forget to repeal it, and centuries later, someone would discover they were still technically responsible for paying a levy established in 1276 because a castle needed repairs, a temporary fix, a permanent revenue stream. Naturally, medieval monastic rules, temporary community guidelines that turned into centuries of discipline. When early monks banded together, they wrote simple rules, temporary guidelines, nothing dramatic. Let's wake up early. Let's pray together. Let's not argue too much. Very wholesome, very flexible. But over time, these temporary rules turned into strict regulations. Wake up at 3 a.m., pray 7 times a day, eat almost nothing, don't smile, don't speak unless necessary, don't look like you're enjoying anything. The rule of Saint Benedict, intended as a gentle guide, became one of the most permanent and unshakable legal structures in the medieval world. Monasteries kept it for centuries, almost unmodified. A temporary idea shaped an entire religious culture, and monks even copied the rules word for word in beautiful manuscripts, which took so long to make that by the time they finished, the rules had become tradition. The medieval funeral customs that refused to dye funeral customs candles, processions, masses, mourning clothes, were often created to address temporary crises: plague, more candles; war, more prayers. A duke had died under questionable circumstances, much longer ceremony, plus some poetic reinterpretations of his personality. Yet these temporary rituals became standard practice. By the late Middle Ages, funerals followed a template so rigid that even minor nobles demanded full processions, hired mourners, special draperies, and extremely long masses. Modern funerals still echo those medieval customs: slow walks, draped cloth, bells, garments, readings, and the expectation that someone somewhere should probably be crying. A temporary sense of solemnity, a permanent human habit. And now, let's drift toward the next medieval mishap. As we gently close out this part, imagine yourself wandering through a medieval town, passing temporary buildings that became permanent, temporary laws that lasted centuries, and temporary habits that somehow shaped the entire future. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? The way small ideas linger, the way temporary solutions become traditions, the way humans then and now quietly refuse to let things go. Take a soft breath, let the history settle, and when you're ready, hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it all the way to part 6, you're either deeply relaxed, delightfully sleepy, or perhaps quietly astonished by how many temporary medieval ideas just refuse to leave. Tonight, we're going to keep floating through more of these long-lasting curiosities, the customs, tools, beliefs, architectural choices, and general medieval stubbornness that somehow survived centuries longer than intended. So go ahead, adjust your blanket, sink deeper into whatever pillow, couch, or slightly uncooperative mattress you've chosen for this historical lullaby. Let your brain soften, let your eyelids drift, and let S slip quietly into the next round of medieval things that lingered far longer than anyone planned. Because of course they did. 1. The medieval habit of putting everything inside a chest. Let's begin with storage. Medieval people loved chests. Big ones, small ones, heavy ones, ones that could crush your foot. Ones carved with lions, saints, vines, and occasionally, what scholars politely describe as unidentifiable creatures, possibly meant to be horses. Now, chests were supposed to be temporary. They were never intended to be humanity's final furniture solution. They were meant to store things on the go: money, documents, clothes, the occasional will, and, naturally, bread that probably shouldn't have been stored with the clothes. But medieval people simply never abandoned the concept. They built chests so sturdy they could stop an axe. They made chests that required 3 grown men to move. They slept on chests. They sat on chests. They used chests as makeshift tables, benches, ladders, walls, and probably, during especially bad winters, emotional support objects. Tables, nice idea, but not essential. Shelves, maybe someday. Dressers, too futuristic, but a chest. A chest was forever. Even after furniture evolved, people kept chests around: family heirlooms, dowry boxes, marriage coffers. A temporary portable storage solution became a household staple for nearly 1,000 years. You might even have one in your own home today, quietly continuing the tradition. 2. Medieval seasonal time, a temporary way of not knowing what time it is. Medieval people measured time creatively. To put it politely, hours were temporary. Literally temporary. A medieval hour changed length depending on the season. Daytime was divided into 12 parts, and nighttime into 12 parts, which meant your hour in summer was long and lazy, while your hour in winter was short and grumpy, perfectly matching the weather. This system was never meant to be permanent. It was simply the easiest way to break up prayers, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, spiritual alarms going off every few hours. The church intended this flexible system to function for now, something practical for monastic communities, sitting in candlelit courtyards, too sleepy to read sundials accurately. But people kept it, and kept it, and kept it. For centuries, clocks tried desperately to make sense of seasonal hours. A candle clock could burn too fast, a sundial could be working fine, but only if the sun remembered to show up, and water clocks. Well, they worked beautifully unless someone bumped them, which someone always did. Even after mechanical clocks arrived, the seasonal hour idea lived on in churches, monasteries, and rural traditions. Medieval Europe clung to inconsistent hours long after consistency was available. A temporary patch for ancient monks became a timeless sand, time-confusing piece of tradition. 3. The medieval feast schedule, a temporary way to prevent riots. Feasts in the Middle Ages were originally created as temporary celebrations tied to harvests, major saints, and events that rulers wanted people to remember. They weren't intended to be permanent holidays. They were community management tools. Let's have a feast so the peasants don't complain this week. Let's bless the crops so people feel hopeful. Let's give knights a reason to stop fighting for 24 hours. Temporary measures, temporary peace. But once you give people a holiday, they don't give it back. Medieval Europe ended up drowning in feast days. Some regions had upwards of 90 per year. In a few places, nearly 1/3 of the calendar involved some level of festivity or at least fasting, which medieval people treated as a festival's tired cousin. Monarchs tried to cut them down. Clergy debated feast inflation. Merchants begged for fewer days off because business kept stalling. But the feasts stayed. Because once a community becomes attached to a ritual involving food, music, and a legally acceptable amount of laziness, it becomes permanent. And in many countries, medieval feast days turned into modern legal holidays. A temporary communal celebration transformed into a long, unbroken chain of days off. 4. The medieval idea that temporary roads could last forever. Roman roads were magnificent. Medieval roads, not so much. But medieval people built temporary roads constantly. Paths for armies marching somewhere inconvenient. Trade routes across fields. Quick detours created to avoid swamps, noble estates, wolves, or in some cases, lakes that had inconveniently appeared after heavy rain. These paths were not planned, they weren't paved, they weren't meant to last, and yet they became permanent. Generations walked the same temporary detours. Farmers built fences around them. Towns based their entire layout on footpaths created centuries earlier by cows who simply wandered in a straight line without permission. To this day, Europe is full of roads that follow bizarre medieval routes. Roads too narrow, too curved, too steep, and too obviously created by someone who never expected future traffic. Urban planners still argue about them, drivers still curse them, but the roads remain, faithfully honoring the memory of medieval indecision. 5. The medieval tendency to name things after saints. Permanently in the early centuries of Christianity, naming places after saints was a temporary solution to spiritual insecurity. Something bad happened nearby. Name it after a saint. A miracle happened nearby. Definitely name it after a saint. A bishop needed more influence. Another saint name. A local lord wanted political legitimacy. Saint name everything in sight. This religious branding wasn't intended to be eternal. It was a quick fix, an attempt to say, please don't smite this town, or please do notice this church, or occasionally, please forgive whatever the local lord definitely did last winter. But the names stuck. Entire regions were named after saints. Every hill, spring, well, and crossroads had a protective saint attached. Travelers followed pilgrim routes that, originally, were meant to be small, temporary spiritual paths, and turned into permanent international highways of faith. Even today, thousands of medieval saint names remain. San Francisco, St. Petersburg, San Marino, São Paulo, Santiago, St. Albans. A temporary blessing became global geography. 6. Medieval ceremonial clothing, a temporary outfit that refused to retire. Imagine wearing a robe designed in 1100, in the year 1500, and then again in 2025. That is essentially the story of ceremonial clothing. Medieval garments were complicated, heavy, layered, decorated, and, most importantly, deeply uncomfortable. Yet they were meant to be temporary outfits for special occasions, coronations, processions, baptisms, funerals, events where you'd expect a bit of visual flair. But nobles got attached, clergy got attached, rulers got very attached. If a robe symbolized power, it stayed. If a crown symbolized legitimacy, it stayed. If a scepter symbolized authority, it definitely stayed. By the late Middle Ages, monarchs looked like they were wearing the entire treasury. Layers of gold thread, gems the size of walnuts, velvet heavy enough to count as resistance training, and, of course, these designs lasted. Modern coronation outfits, judge robes, bishop vestments, graduation gowns, and academic regalia all descend from medieval clothing that was supposed to be used once and then quietly forgotten. Instead, we're still wearing it. A temporary costume turned into a global dress code. 7. Medieval landlords inventing temporary rents that never went away. Rents in medieval Europe were originally temporary payments. You paid a landlord for using land, tools, mills, ovens, or just existing somewhere near their personal space. The payments were supposed to adjust or disappear over time. But landlords discovered something shocking. They liked money. So temporary rents became permanent rents. And permanent rents became generational. And generational rents became legal obligations tied to the land itself. People ended up paying rents established centuries before, for reasons no one remembered, for buildings that no longer existed, or for privileges no one used. In one charming case, a family in France paid rent for the maintenance of a bridge, even though the bridge washed away in 1321, and the payments continued, because naturally, the landlord insisted the money should keep coming just in case a new bridge is someday desirable. These medieval rent traditions evolved into feudal dues, then into early modern land taxes, and in some places, they somehow influenced modern tenancy laws. A temporary source of income turned into a multi-century financial tradition. 8. Medieval hairstyles that refused to leave the building. Temporary hairstyles rarely stay temporary, especially in the Middle Ages. Clergy invented the tonsure, shaving the top of the head to symbolize humility. It was meant to be a temporary ritual shave before entering certain religious roles. But monks kept it, priests kept it, entire monastic orders standardized it. And for centuries, a ring of hair around a pale bald circle became the signature medieval haircut, the kind of style only a monk could love. Knights weren't much better. They invented temporary styles for tournaments and ceremonies. Braids, long curls, hair oiled into strange positions, a fringe haircut that looked suspiciously like modern boy band styles but with more chainmail. These looks were not meant to endure. But medieval fashion clung to old hairstyles with a persistence normally reserved for barnacles or political rumors. Some styles lasted 5 centuries. Some traveled across continents. Some became symbols of social class. A temporary trim transformed into identity. 9. Medieval court rituals, temporary formalities that became eternal theater court rituals, kneeling, bowing, procession orders. Gift exchanges were originally created as temporary solutions for demanding nobles who didn't know how to behave around kings. A quick etiquette fix, something to prevent arguments about who should stand where. But courts embraced ritual like a hobby. By the late Middle Ages, you had to bow exactly the right amount. You had to enter rooms in a specific order. You had to speak with very precise phrases. You had to touch the king's hand in the correct way, at the correct angle, while looking sufficiently respectful but not dazzlingly confident. These temporary gestures became permanent tradition. 100 years later, no one remembered why you had to take 2 steps back when leaving the throne room, but you still did it. And many of these rituals survived into the modern era. Royal courts still perform medieval gestures. Diplomatic ceremonies still follow medieval structures. Even graduation ceremonies echo medieval courtroom processions. a temporary etiquette guide, became a centuries-long play that no one stopped performing, gently drifting toward part 7. And so we float onward, through a world where nothing temporary stays temporary, where every quick fix becomes a tradition, where every patch becomes a custom, and where medieval decisions, practical, silly, desperate, or simply convenient, still echo in our daily lives. Take another soft breath, let the images fade gently, and when you're ready, hey everyone, if you're still with me at this point, first of all, congratulations. You have survived 7 full parts of medieval persistence, medieval stubbornness, and medieval no, really. We're still doing this, so let's drift into our final stretch tonight. Settle a little deeper, adjust the pillow, let your eyes soften, and we'll continue floating through the curiosities of the Middle Ages, those strange little relics that were supposed to be temporary, or at least short-lived, but instead decided to become permanent features of the European world, and naturally, many of them are still haunting us. Let's drift back into the candlelit halls of medieval life, where the strange lasted far longer than anyone intended, simply because no one wanted to be the person who said, maybe we should stop this. After all, stopping something takes effort, and medieval society was many things, but efficient at updating old customs was not one of them. So tonight, as we glide toward the end of our sleepy journey, we'll wander through a few more examples of how medieval people invented temporary ideas that absolutely refused to die. Just the way your phone alarm refuses to stop even after you've shut it off 4 times. The eternal medieval obsession with heraldry. Heraldry was supposed to be simple, just a visual identification system to tell knights apart during tournaments or battles. Because when everyone is wearing the same metal bucket on their head and looks like a shiny baked potato with legs, you need something to differentiate them. That was all heraldry was meant to do. But medieval elites, being medieval elites, it absolutely spiraled. Soon, heraldry evolved from "That's Sir Robert" into "That's Sir Robert," the 3rd son of the 2nd cousin of Lady Agnes of Crumplewick, bearer of the squirrel rampant. As you're on a field of stubbornness, coats of arms got more complicated than medieval tax codes. You couldn't just put a lion on your shield. Everyone had lions. You had to put something exotic like a panther, a manticore, or a goose that looked suspiciously passive-aggressive, and it had to symbolize something very important, even if no one remembered what. The funny part, this temporary battlefield necessity became a hereditary identity marker that survived centuries. You can still find people today proudly showing off a coat of arms that one of their ancestors invented, because they wanted to impress a king 700 years ago. Heraldry was supposed to be temporary. It became a multi-generational personality trait. The medieval church bells that never, ever stopped ringing. You'd think bells would be used occasionally, marking time, signaling mass, maybe warning villagers of a Viking raid. Reasonable things. But medieval Europeans decided bells needed to narrate their entire day. Every hour, bell. Every prayer, bell. Every feast day, bell. Every minor saint's anniversary, bell. Every time Father Bernard dropped something heavy in the nave, probably bell. And perhaps the funniest part is that medieval people genuinely believed bells could drive away storms, devils, witches, and misfortune. Some bells were even blessed specifically to dispel thunderstorms, because of course the best defense against meteorological danger is bronze acoustics. This belief was meant to fade as science advanced. It did not. Many European towns still ring their bells constantly, proudly maintaining rhythms set in the 12th century, and yes, they still use some of the same old bells. Imagine being kept awake by a 900-year-old noise that was supposed to be a temporary spiritual tool. The medieval temporary beard fashions. Beards in medieval Europe evolved faster than royal alliances. One decade, everyone wanted to look like an apostle. The next, everyone shaved clean because a French king decided stubble offended him spiritually. Henry V of England kept a beard because he thought it made him look older and more respectable. He was 25 and looked like a medieval Boy Scout leader, so perhaps he wasn't wrong. Beard fashions were never meant to become generational standards, but somehow, medieval beard politics helped form long-lasting stereotypes. The English beard, sometimes the French, beard rarely the Germans, beard always the Italians, beard only when it looks like art. Centuries later, these stereotypes still stubbornly linger, all because medieval kings couldn't stop experimenting with face hair, as if it were a national identity statement. The medieval obsession with relics that never ended in the Middle Ages. Saints' relics were temporary devotional items, just thoughtful spiritual reminders. Then people started competing to collect them, and then they started faking them. And then they began acquiring entire skeletons of saints who may not have existed. By the 14th century, one church proudly displayed 3 different skulls of John the Baptist in 3 separate sizes. Because why not? Relic veneration was supposed to be temporary, a small devotional practice. Today, millions still visit medieval relics every year, making it one of the most enduring tourism models ever invented. If medieval pilgrims were alive, they'd say, "We told you it would catch on." The medieval university system, built as a short-term fixed universities today, are permanent, respected institutions, but medieval Europe invented them as a temporary solution to a shortage of trained clergy. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, these places began as improvised clusters of scholars trying not to freeze, starve, or get arrested by local authorities. The university, as a concept, wasn't meant to stick around forever. It was a quick fix, an educational pop-up shop, a medieval learning kiosk. The rules were chaotic. Classes were wherever there was space. Students were often barely literate teenagers with swords. Professors were underpaid, overworked monks who wanted a nap. And somehow, we built the entire modern world on this system. Even the gowns, yes, the graduation gowns you see today, those are just medieval winter coats, not symbolism, not tradition, just insulation, and they never went away. The medieval calendars that wouldn't die. Medieval Europeans inherited the Roman calendar and immediately began adjusting it, tweaking it, and arguing about it endlessly. Some months randomly got extra feast days. Some years were counted twice. Easter moved around like a guilty suspect, avoiding interrogation. The calendar should have been reformed quickly. Instead, we lived with medieval calendar confusion until the 20th century. Even England didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, which means Shakespeare lived his entire life under a medieval timekeeping system that was technically wrong. Imagine being born, living, and dying, all in a glitch. The medieval idea of temporary crusader states. The crusader kingdoms were supposed to be short-term military footholds, just long enough to regain control of holy sites. But naturally, once knights got there, they said, this climate is kind of nice. The food is different. Let's stay forever. Suddenly you had Europeans building French-style castles in the Levant, creating hybrid cultures, launching dynastic dramas, and forming awkward wedding alliances that made absolutely no sense. It was chaotic, unstable, and doomed. And still, for nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader states clung on. Temporary. No, more like stubbornly refusing to pack their bags. Medieval problem-solving. The art of doing nothing until it becomes tradition. This may be the most relatable feature of the entire era. Most things that lasted unexpectedly long in the Middle Ages did so because doing nothing was easier than doing something. Plumbing problems, ignore it. Political issues, marry someone. Economic collapse, pray about it. Strange tradition, keep it. Random superstition, sounds fine. You weren't supposed to light candles during an eclipse. People did anyway. And somewhere, someone wrote it down, and suddenly it was official. The final drift, why medieval temporaries last forever. And so, as we float to the end of our sleepy journey, we return to the strange truth. Medieval Europe was magnificent at making things that accidentally lasted long after the Middle Ages ended. They weren't planning for legacy. They weren't trying to influence the modern world. They were just living day to day, reacting, improvising, and sometimes panicking. Yet here we are, still living with their leftovers. Heraldry, bells, universities, calendars, fashion trends, relics, legal systems, city layouts, cultural habits, and yes, even the sense of humor. The Middle Ages were temporary, but the things they created, Many became permanent, without anyone noticing. And now, as we end this last part, let your mind soften. Let the medieval world fade into the dark warmth of sleep, and drift off knowing that even the things that seem fleeting can last far longer than expected, including you, still awake after 8 parts of medieval persistence. Rest well, traveler. Until the next sleepy story. Hey again, welcome back. If you're still with me half awake, deeply calm, maybe drifting in and out like a medieval monk during a very long sermon, just settle in. Part 7 is here, and tonight we're gliding through even more medieval ideas that were never supposed to last, yet somehow became permanent fixtures of the world. It's comforting, in a sleepy sort of way. You can almost imagine a medieval craftsman shrugging and saying, "This will do for now," unaware that future generations would still be dealing with his choices 800 years later. So take a breath, let the modern world fade, and let's drift back into the candlelit corridors of the Middle Ages, where temporary solutions went to become immortal. 1. The medieval tendency to turn temporary markets into permanent cities. Let's begin with something simple. Markets. Medieval Europe loved temporary fairs, little gatherings where merchants would set up stalls for a week or two, sell everything from spices to questionable cheese, and then move on. These fairs weren't meant to be foundations for civilization. They were weekend pop-up shops before pop-up shops were trendy. But people kept returning. Buyers, sellers, travelers, minstrels, thieves who saw opportunity, and the occasional bishop who wandered in and pretended he didn't notice the gambling booth at the edge. The temporary market became a semi-permanent market. Then someone built a tavern, then a blacksmith, then a church, because medieval towns never missed a chance to add a church. Then people started building houses, because walking to the fair every day was exhausting. And before anyone realized it, the temporary fair had become a town. Some of Europe's biggest cities, Frankfurt, Bruges, Ghent, grew from seasonal markets that refused to pack up. What began as a few stalls selling wool turned into international trading hubs, complete with laws, taxes, and, naturally, very questionable medieval plumbing. A temporary arrangement became a permanent address. 2. The medieval habit of building temporary wooden bridges, then rebuilding them forever. Medieval bridges were usually temporary wooden structures, quick, cheap, functional. They were meant to last a season or two, maybe a decade, if the river behaved and local teenagers didn't. But medieval rivers rarely behaved. Floods washed bridges away, ice cracked them, merchants overloaded them. Carts with wheels that hadn't been maintained since the previous century rattled across them with surprising enthusiasm. So towns rebuilt the bridges, again and again and again. The bridge became a permanent project, not a permanent structure, and everyone accepted this. Some towns rebuilt the same temporary bridge 30 or 40 times before eventually deciding after a few centuries that maybe stone would be a better idea. Other towns never made the upgrade at all. They simply kept rebuilding the wood. It was tradition, a ritual, part of the annual town budget. Repairs for the bridge that absolutely will not survive spring. And these humble wooden bridges shaped medieval trade routes, city layouts, and even political boundaries. A temporary river crossing became the backbone of European geography. 3. Medieval pilgrim badges, a temporary souvenir that became an international industry. Pilgrimage in medieval Europe was supposed to be a personal spiritual journey. Something simple, something temporary. You traveled to a shrine, had your moment of religious reflection, perhaps prayed for a relative who had the flu, and then you went home. But medieval people discovered a new joy along the way: souvenirs. And so pilgrim badges, small metal tokens, were born. They were originally a temporary marker showing you had completed the journey. Think of them like medieval "I visited Jerusalem, and all I got was this badge" merch. But soon, everyone wanted them. Merchants mass-produced them, medieval mass production being a very enthusiastic version of someone with a mold. Towns sold unique design saints, relics, symbols, apocalyptic monsters, and occasionally something that looked suspiciously like a badly drawn octopus. Pilgrimage became less about spiritual devotion and more about collecting badges, like a medieval Pokemon run. Some pilgrims returned home wearing so many badges they clanked when they walked. One chronicler even described a pilgrim who looked like a traveling shrine. These temporary trinkets became symbols of identity, proof of travel, bragging rights, and eventually standard items in wills. People passed them down as heirlooms. Souvenirs meant to last a week instead lasted centuries. 4. Medieval siege tactics that became permanent military doctrines. Siege warfare was supposed to be temporary, a one-time solution to a very specific problem. The castle door was closed, and you wanted it not to be. Simple. So medieval armies invented temporary tools, ladders, siege towers, battering rams, catapults that were definitely not designed by anyone with engineering expertise. And of course, the trebuchet, the medieval equivalent of a very slow, very dramatic, very heavy tantrum. These machines were meant to be built on site, used for a few weeks, and then forgotten. But medieval warfare had a habit of repeating itself, so siege equipment became standard, then professionalized, then institutionalized. By the 14th century, temporary siege inventions had turned into a full military science, complete with specialized engineers, permanent roles in armies, strategy manuals, and rules about how to aim the trebuchet without accidentally flattening your own tent. And some siege tactics survived into early modern warfare. A temporary assault method became a permanent chapter in military history. 5. The medieval pub, a temporary stop that became the heart of society in the early Middle Ages. Taverns and alehouses were temporary roadside stops, places to get a drink, rest a horse, hear gossip, or recover from the emotional damage of traveling medieval roads. They weren't supposed to become institutions, just places to refuel before moving on. But medieval people loved socializing far too much, so they lingered, and returned, and transformed taverns into community hubs. The alehouse became the news center, the job board, the gossip network, the unofficial courthouse, the matchmaking hub, the venue for questionable medieval singing, and the emotional support center for people dealing with feudalism, which, to be fair, was everyone soon. Taverns had permanent names: the Golden Lion, the King's Crown, the Duck, and something unidentifiable, and regular patrons. Governments tried to regulate them. Priests tried to condemn them. Monarchs tried to tax them into oblivion, but taverns thrived. A temporary drinking stop became a cornerstone of social life and the ancestor of the modern pub. 6. Medieval apologies to saints, temporary rituals that turned into lifelong traditions. Medieval Europeans apologized to saints. Often, if a storm was approaching, someone apologized to Saint Medard. If a plague seemed imminent, someone apologized to Saint Roch. Lost keys, definitely the fault of some forgotten saint you'd accidentally offended. Originally, these rituals were temporary, created during crises, but crisis was the medieval default setting, and so apologizing to saints became a permanent tradition, a daily habit, an instinct. By the 13th century, people made saint offerings for everything: bad weather, sick horses, injured ankles, poor crop yields, suspicious dreams, angry neighbors, angry chickens, and, occasionally, guilt about not attending church the previous month or year. Entire festivals grew around these apologies, and shrines multiplied to meet demand. Temporary rituals became annual traditions, which became cultural customs, which in some places continue today under new names and gentler expectations. 7. Medieval temporary walls inside houses that never got removed. Inside medieval homes, temporary walls were common. People used wooden screens, tapestries, woven partitions, curtains thick enough to qualify as medieval winter clothing, and random pieces of furniture used as makeshift dividers. These were not intended as permanent interior design solutions. They were practical responses to cold drafts, privacy needs, relatives who overstayed their welcome, and rooms that were basically big wooden boxes with no natural organization. But medieval homes were fragile, and permanent walls were expensive, so families kept the temporary partitions, and kept them, and never took them down. Some tapestries hung in the same place for over 150 years. Some screens became heirlooms. Some makeshift walls became structural fixtures. Interior architecture evolved around these temporary solutions. Whole traditions of room division can be traced back to early medieval just hang this here for now decisions. A temporary fix became an entire architectural style. 8. Medieval social rules for eating, temporary manners that became modern etiquette. Medieval eating habits were chaotic. People shared bowls, shared cups, used knives as multi-purpose tools, and ripped meat apart with fingers that had not seen soap since the previous century. So nobles tried to introduce temporary rules. Don't stab your neighbor with your knife. Don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth. Don't drink straight from the serving pitcher. And please stop throwing bones under the table. These rules were supposed to be practical guidelines for communal dining, but the nobility turned them into status symbols, then into habits, then into tradition. By the late Middle Ages, etiquette manuals emerged, complex, strict, often unreasonable. Don't slurp. Don't lick your fingers even though everyone still did. Don't stare at the host while chewing. Don't cut bread with a knife, it's rude. Don't talk too much. Don't talk too little. And for the love of all saints, don't dip your entire hand into the communal saucepot. These temporary manners evolved into modern etiquette, the very rules we still follow at dinner tables worldwide. A temporary eating guideline became permanent social logic. And now, let's drift gently toward part 8. So here we are again, gliding through another collection of medieval improvisations that somehow shaped our modern world. Chests that turned into furniture traditions, markets that became cities, taverns that became social institutions, bridges that towns rebuilt until the concept of maintenance became a personality trait. Take a soft breath in, let it drift out, and let your thoughts melt into the quiet rhythm of medieval life.